Among the clay tablets recovered from the ruins of Ugarit, a city on the Syrian coast, is a letter written in the final years of the settlement. In it, a king describes enemy ships appearing offshore and his cities burning. He says his troops are stationed elsewhere and the country is abandoned to itself. Around the same era, the Hittite capital of Hattusa was left empty and later burned. Palaces in Greece fell silent. A writing system used by Mycenaean administrators disappeared from the record entirely. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, within what is, in historical terms, a relatively narrow window of time, many of the major urban and political systems of the Late Bronze Age came under severe pressure or stopped functioning altogether. These events did not happen on the same night. They unfolded across several generations, at different moments, for different reasons in different places. And after more than a century of archaeological investigation, historians still disagree about the primary causes. To understand why the collapse was so widespread, you first have to understand what the Bronze Age had built. By the 13th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East contained one of the most interconnected political and commercial systems the ancient world had yet produced. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the city-states of the Levantine coast, Cyprus, Babylon, these were not self-sufficient. They were participants in a network of trade, diplomacy, and obligation that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Kings corresponded on clay tablets. They arranged royal marriages. They sent each other carefully itemized gifts and expected specific goods in return. Merchants moved along established routes, and the records they left suggest a level of commercial coordination that would not reappear in the region for centuries. Bronze itself required this network. The metal depended on both copper and tin, and reliable access to both required long-distance supply routes whose exact sources remain debated by scholars. Disrupting those routes would have weakened military supply, elite exchange, and palace-controlled production. But this interconnection was also a structural vulnerability. The same connections that transmitted prosperity could also transmit disruption. When agricultural systems weakened and trade flows thinned in one part of the network, problems could intensify elsewhere. Warning signs appeared before the major destruction events. Several paleoclimate records from the eastern Mediterranean, including pollen cores, sediment sequences, and stalagmite analyses, suggest a significant and prolonged reduction in rainfall beginning in the late 13th century BCE across parts of the Levant, Anatolia, and Greece. These records indicate extended periods of agricultural stress rather than a single sudden drought. Their precise dates and regional reach are still being debated and refined by researchers. At the same time, the palace economies of the Bronze Age had structural weaknesses. They were centralized systems that collected agricultural surplus and redistributed it, keeping garrisons supplied, specialist craftspeople fed, and tribute flowing outward. When harvests became unreliable, that redistribution became harder to sustain. There is also evidence of population movement across this period. Communities relocating, coastlines becoming less secure, land routes disrupted. Some of those moving populations would eventually appear in Egyptian records under a collective label that has fascinated and frustrated researchers ever since. In the 8th year of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egyptian inscriptions at the Temple of Medinet Habu describe coordinated attacks by land and sea by groups identified in the Egyptian account by several different names, among them the Peleset, the Cheka, and the Shekelesh. These inscriptions are Ramesses III's official royal account of events. They present an Egyptian military victory and serve the purposes of royal commemoration. Scholars treat them as an important but partial source, not a neutral historical report. The modern collective label Sea Peoples was applied by later scholars, not by the Egyptians or anyone else in the ancient world. It groups together what may have been migrants, raiders, displaced communities, mercenaries, and various ethnic or political groups, some of whom the Egyptians had encountered before in other contexts. Where these people came from is genuinely uncertain. Proposals have ranged from the Aegean and Anatolia to the Western Mediterranean. Their role in the collapse is also contested. Many researchers now argue that the groups called the Sea Peoples may have been both participants in the crisis and products of it, populations themselves displaced by the same pressures that were weakening the systems they raided. They were real. Their impact was real. but treating them as the primary cause of a collapse that had been developing for decades would be an oversimplification that the evidence does not support. What the archaeological record gives us, for those final years, is fragments. Urgent fragments. At Pylos in Greece, Linear B tablets, the administrative script of Mycenaean palace bureaucracies, refer to coastal watch arrangements and the mobilization of rowers, suggesting that the palace was organizing a response to growing insecurity. Whether this was in the final weeks before the destruction of Pylos or somewhat earlier remains a matter of scholarly discussion. Shortly afterward, the palace burned. No Linear B texts appear at Pylos after that point. The writing system itself vanishes from the Greek record for several centuries. The Hittite capital of Hattusa presents a different and more ambiguous picture. Excavations suggest that parts of the city may already have been evacuated before burning occurred, implying a process of withdrawal rather than a sudden military defeat. The precise sequence of events at Hattusa, and what ended the Hittite state, continues to be studied. The empire itself simply stops leaving records. And then there is Ugarit. Among the late correspondence found at Ugarit is a letter traditionally associated with King Amurapi, preserved in the city's cuneiform archive. The letter, known as RS 18.147, describes enemy ships appearing offshore and towns burning. The king writes that his troops and ships have been sent to assist allies elsewhere, leaving the city without adequate defense. Scholars have debated the letter's exact context, whether it was ever sent, and what it precisely describes. What is not in dispute is that Ugarit was destroyed around 1190 BCE and never rebuilt. The letter captures, with unusual directness, the anxiety of a state under pressure that it could not resolve. The harder question is not why any one city fell, but why the pattern was so geographically broad and why recovery was so limited. One influential framework, developed by archaeologist Eric Klein, describes the collapse as a convergence of interacting stressors: climate stress, agricultural disruption, trade breakdown, social unrest, conflict, and institutional fragility, none of which alone would have been fatal, but whose combination overwhelmed systems that had been designed to handle disruption one problem at a time. Other researchers have emphasized regional variation, arguing that the collapse should not be treated as a single event and that different areas experienced different combinations of pressures at different times. What the evidence does suggest is this: the palace economies of the Late Bronze Age were efficient at distributing surplus and coordinating exchange, but that efficiency depended on stable inputs. When climate stress reduced agricultural output across a wide area, and when trade routes became less reliable at the same time, and when populations were already moving, the redistribution systems that held these states together found themselves unable to maintain normal functions. The same connections that created prosperity also transmitted disruption. Problems in one region could worsen conditions elsewhere. And when enough nodes in the system weakened simultaneously, recovery became very difficult. Not every Bronze Age state collapsed equally. Egypt survived, diminished. Assyria showed resilience. Some Levantine cities continued. The civilizations that suffered most severely were those most dependent on the palace-centered redistributive model: the Mycenaean kingdoms, the Hittite Empire, and the great trading cities of the Levantine coast. What followed the crisis period was genuinely different from what had existed before. Population levels declined significantly in parts of Greece and Anatolia. Urban centers contracted or disappeared. The administrative systems of the palace economies, their writing systems, their tribute records, their diplomatic networks, largely vanished. Linear B was not replaced by another writing system in Greece for several centuries. The transition to iron as a dominant working metal was gradual and technically demanding. It was not a simple substitution. Bronze remained important for some time. But iron production reduced dependence on the specific long-distance supply routes required for tin and copper, and over the following centuries it became increasingly central to tool and weapon production across the region. The term Dark Age is sometimes applied to the period that followed. It is worth noting that this label describes a reduction in the kinds of evidence historians can read: monumental architecture, administrative texts, long-distance trade goods, rather than an absence of human activity. In some areas, new regional political structures were forming even as the palace economies dissolved. The Bronze Age collapse does not have a clean answer. researchers continue to debate the relative weight of climate, conflict, trade disruption, and political fragility, and they continue to find new evidence that complicates older conclusions. What it offers, more than a solved mystery, is a case study in how complexity works. Interconnected systems can be remarkably resilient until enough of what connects them fails at once. The comparison to other periods and other systems is not exact. Historical parallels are rarely clean. But the questions the Bronze Age collapse raises about resilience, vulnerability, and the limits of institutional adaptation are not purely ancient. Subscribe if you want to keep following these questions. And if you have a view on the debate, the comments are worth reading. See you in the dark.